Hi guys, let's start chapter 1 of class 10 NCERT history textbook. That is the rise of nationalism in Europe. Here's a figure. Figure 1. The dream of worldwide democratic and social republics. The Pact Between Nations, a print prepared by Frederick Sorio, 1848. In 1848, Frederick Sorio, a French artist, prepared a series of 4 prints visualizing his dream of a world made up of democratic and social republics, as he called them. The first print, Figure 1 of the series, shows the people of Europe and America, men and women of all ages and social classes, marching in a long train. So they are marching in a long train. Okay. So they are marching in a long train and offering homage to the Statue of Liberty as they pass by. So this is the Statue of Liberty. So they are paying homage to the Statue of Liberty as they pass by. As they pass by it. As you would recall, artists of the time of the French Revolution personified liberty as a female. So they personified liberty as a female figure. Here you can recognize the torch of enlightenment. Here you can recognize the torch of enlightenment she bears in one hand and the charter of the rights of man in the other. On the earth, in the foreground of the image, lie the shattered remains of the symbols of absolutist institutions. So, what is this absolutist? Literally, a government or system of rule that has no restraints on the power exercised. In history, the term refers to a form of monarchical government that was centralized, militarized, and repressive. In Sorio's utopian vision, the peoples of the world are grouped as distinct nations, identified through their flags and national costume. Leading the procession way past the Statue of Liberty are the United States and Switzerland, which by this time were already nation states. So, what is this utopian? A vision of a society that is so ideal that it is unlikely to actually exist. So it is a vision of a society that is ideal. France, identifiable by the revolutionary tricolor, has just reached the statue. She is followed by the peoples of Germany, bearing the black, red, and gold flag. Interestingly, at the time when Sorio created this image, the German peoples did not yet exist as a united nation. The flag they carry is an expression of liberal hopes in 1848 to unify the numerous German-speaking principalities into a nation-state under a democratic constitution. Following the German people are the people of Austria, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Lombardy, Poland, England, Ireland, Hungary, and Russia. From the heavens above, Christ, saints, and angels gaze upon the scene. They have been used by the artist to symbolize fraternity. So, the Christ, saints, and angels gaze upon the scene, and they have been used by the artist to symbolize fraternity among the nations of the world. This chapter will deal with many of the issues visualized by Sorio in Figure 1. During the 19th century, nationalism emerged as a force. So, during the 19th century, nationalism emerged as a force, which brought about sweeping changes in the political and mental world of Europe. The end result of these changes was the emergence of the nation state in place of the multinational dynastic empires in Europe. So, in place of the dynastic rulers, there came nation states because of this nationalism which emerged as a force. The concept and practices of a modern state. So, the concept and practices of a modern state in which a centralized power exercised sovereign control over a clearly defined territory had been developing over a long period of time in Europe. But a nation state was one in which the majority of its citizens and not only its rulers came to develop a sense of common identity and shared history or descent. So, but a nation state was one in which the majority of its citizens, so the citizens and not only its rulers, came to develop. So the citizens they develop a sense of common identity and shared history or descent. These commonness did not exist from time immemorial. So this commonness did not exist from time immemorial. It was forged through struggles, through the actions of leaders and the common people. So it was forged through struggles, through the actions of leaders and the common people. This chapter will look at the diverse processes through which nation states and nationalism came into being in 19th century Europe. And here's a source we have here. Source A. Ernst Renan, What is a Nation? In a lecture delivered in the University of Sorbonne in 1880 at the University of Sorbonne in 1882, the French philosopher Ernst Renan 1823 to 92 outlined his understanding of what makes a nation. The lecture was subsequently published as a famous essay entitled Quest c'est qu'une nation? What is a nation? In this essay, Renan criticizes the notion suggested by others that a nation is formed by a common language, race, religion, or territory. A nation is the culmination of a long past of endeavors, sacrifice, and devotion. A heroic past, great man, glory, that is the social capital upon which one bases a national idea. To have common glories in the past, to have a common will in the present, to have performed great deeds together, to wish to perform still more, these are the essential conditions of being a people. A nation is therefore a large-scale solidarity. Its existence is a daily plebiscite. A province is its inhabitants. If anyone has the right to be consulted, it is the inhabitant. A nation never has any real interest in annexing or holding on to a country against its will. The existence of nations is a good thing, a necessity even. Their existence is a guarantee of liberty which would be lost if the world had only one law and only one master. So, what does this plebiscite mean? It's a direct vote by which all the people of a region are asked to accept or reject a proposal. Then we have 1. The French Revolution and the idea of the nation. So here's a figure. We have here a figure, figure 2. The cover of a German almanac designed by the journalist Andreas Rappmann in 1798. The image of the French Bastille being stormed by the revolutionary crowd has been placed next to a similar fortress meant to represent the bastion of despotic rule in the German province of Kassel. Accompanying the illustration is the slogan, "The people must seize their own freedom." Rebmann lived in the city of Mainz and was a member of a German Jacobin group. So this is the design by a journalist named Andreas Rebmann. Okay. The first clear expression of nationalism came with the French Revolution in 1789. France, as you would remember, was a full-fledged territorial state in 1789 under the rule of an absolute monarch. The political and constitutional changes that came in the wake of the French Revolution led to the transfer of sovereignty from the monarch to a body of French citizens. The revolution proclaimed that it was the people who would henceforth constitute the nation and shape its destiny. From the very beginning, the French revolutionaries introduced various measures and practices that could create a sense of collective identity amongst the French people. The ideas of la prairie. Okay, the ideas of la patrie, the fatherland, and les citoyens, the citizen. So the ideas of la patrie, the fatherland, and les citoyens, the citizen, emphasized the notion of a unity, of united, okay. It emphasized the nation, or it emphasized the notion of a united community enjoying equal rights under a constitution. A new French flag, the tricolor, was chosen to replace the former royal standard. The Estates General was elected by the body of active citizens and renamed the National Assembly. New hymns were composed, oaths taken, and martyrs commemorated, all in the name of the nation. A centralized administrative system was put in place, and it formulated uniform laws for all citizens within its territory. Internal customs duties and dues were abolished, and a uniform system of weights and measures was adopted. Regional dialects were discouraged, and French, as it was spoken and written in Paris, became the common language of the nation. So French became the common language of the nation. The revolutionaries further declared that it was the mission and the destiny of the French nation to liberate the peoples of Europe from despotism, in other words, to help other peoples of Europe to become nations. When the news of the events in France reached the different cities of Europe, students and other members of educated middle classes began setting up Jacobin clubs. Their activities and campaigns prepared the way for the French armies, which moved into Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and much of Italy in the 1790s. With the outbreak of the Revolutionary Wars, the French armies began to carry the idea of nationalism abroad. So the French armies began to carry the idea of nationalism abroad. Here's a map. We have a map here. Figure 3. Europe after the Congress of Vienna in 1815. So this is how the Europe looks like after the Congress of Vienna. Within the wide swath of territory that came under his control. Within the wide swathe of territory that came under his control, Napoleon set about introducing many of the reforms that he had already introduced in France. Through a return to monarchy, Napoleon had no doubt destroyed democracy in France, but in the administrative field he had incorporated revolutionary principles in order to make the whole system more rational and efficient. The Civil Code of 1804, usually known as the Napoleonic Code, did away with all privileges based on birth, established equality before the law, and secured the right to property. This code was exported to the regions under French control in the Dutch Republic, in Switzerland, in Italy, and Germany. Napoleon simplified administrative divisions, abolished the feudal system, and freed peasants from serfdom and manorial dues. In the towns, too, guild restrictions were removed. Transport and communication systems were improved. Peasants, artisans, workers, and new businessmen enjoyed a new-found freedom. So many people enjoyed a new-found freedom. We have a figure here, figure 4, the planting of tree of liberty in Zweibrücken, Germany. Figure 4. The planting of Tree of Liberty in Zweibrücken, Germany. The subject of this color print by the German painter Karl Caspar Fritz is the occupation of the town of Zweibrücken. Okay, so it's the occupation of the town of Zweibrücken by the French armies. French soldiers, recognizable by their blue, white, and red uniforms, have been portrayed as oppressors as they seize a peasant's cart, left, harass some young women, center foreground, and force a peasant down to his knees. The plaque being affixed to the Tree of Liberty carries a German inscription which is translated, reads, which in translation reads, "Take freedom and equality from us, the model of humanity." This is a sarcastic reference to the claim of the French as being liberators who opposed monarchy in the territories they entered. Okay. Businessmen and small-scale producers of goods in particular, began to realize that uniform laws, standardized weights and measures, and common national currency would facilitate the movement and exchange of goods and capital from one region to another. However, in the areas conquered, the reactions of the local populations to French rule were mixed. Initially, in many places, such as Holland and Switzerland, as well as in certain cities like Brussels, Mainz, Milan, and Warsaw, the French armies were welcomed as harbingers of liberty. So they were first welcomed as harbingers of liberty, but the initial enthusiasm soon turned to hostility as it became clear that the new administrative arrangements did not go hand in hand with political freedom. Increased taxation, censorship, forced conscription into the French armies required to conquer the rest of Europe all seemed to outweigh the advantages of the administrative changes. So, increased taxation, then censorship, forced conscription into the French armies required to conquer the rest of Europe all seem to outweigh the advantages of the administrative changes. Figure 5. The courier in Rhineland loses all that he has on his way home from Leipzig. Napoleon here is represented as a postman on his way back to France after he lost the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. Each letter dropping out of his bag bears the names of the territories he lost. The making of nationalism in Europe. Some important dates. 1797 Napoleon invades Italy. Napoleonic Wars begin. 1814 to 1815 Fall of Napoleon. The Vienna Peace Settlement. 1821 Greek struggle for independence begins. 1848 Revolutions in Europe. Artisans, industrial workers, and peasants revolt against economic hardships. Middle classes demand constitutions and representative governments. Italians, Germans, Magyars, Polish, Czechs, etc. demand nation states. 1859 to 1870 Unification of Italy. 1866 to 1871 Unification of Germany. 1805 Slave nationalism gathers force in the Habsburg and Ottoman empires. If you look at the map of mid-18th century Europe, you will find that there were no nation-states as we know them today. What we know today as Germany, Italy, and Switzerland were divided into kingdoms, duchies, and cantons. What we know today as Germany, Italy, and Switzerland were divided into kingdoms, duchies, and cantons, where rulers had their autonomous territories. Eastern and Central Europe were under autocratic monarchies, within the territories of which lived diverse people. They did not see themselves as sharing a collective identity or a common culture. Often they even spoke different languages and belonged to different ethnic groups. The Habsburg Empire that ruled over Austria-Hungary, for example, was a patchwork of many different regions and peoples. It included the Alpine region, the Tyrol, Austria, and the Sudetenland, as well as Bohemia, where the aristocracy was predominantly German-speaking. It also included the Italian-speaking provinces of Lombardy and Venetia. In Hungary, half of the population spoke Magyar, while the other half spoke a variety of dialects. In Galicia, the aristocracy spoke Polish. Besides these three dominant groups, there also lived within the boundaries of the empire. So, besides these three dominant groups, there also lived within the boundaries of the empire a mass of subject peasant peoples, Bohemians and Slovaks to the north, Slovenes in Carniola, Croats to the south, and Romans to the east in Pennsylvania. Such differences did not easily promote a sense of political unity. The only tie binding these diverse groups together was a common allegiance to the emperor. So there were many different varieties of people speaking different languages from different ethnicity, but the only common bond which they had was the allegiance to the emperor. How did nationalism and the idea of the nation state emerge? 2.1 The aristocracy and the new middle class. Socially and politically, a landed aristocracy was the dominant class on the continent. The members of this class were united by a common way of life that cut across regional divisions. They owned estates in the countryside and also town houses. They spoke French for purposes of diplomacy and in high society. Their families were often connected by ties of marriage. This powerful aristocracy was, however, numerically a small group. The majority of the population was made up of peasantry. So the majority of the population was made up of peasantry. To the west, the bulk of the land was farmed by tenants and small owners, while in Eastern and Central Europe, the pattern of landholdings was characterized by vast estates, which were cultivated by serf. So, to the west, the bulk of the land was farmed by tenants and small owners, while in Eastern and Central Europe, the pattern of landholding was characterized by vast estates which were cultivated by serfs. In Western and parts of Central Europe, the growth of industrial production and trade meant the growth of towns and the emergence of commercial classes whose existence was based on production for the market. Industrialization began in England in the second half of the 18th century, but in France and parts of the German states it occurred only during the 19th century. So, industrialization began in England in the second half of the 18th century, but in France and parts of German states it occurred only during the 19th century. In its wake, new social groups came into being, a working class population and middle classes made up of industrialists, businessmen, professionals. In Central and Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, these groups were smaller in number till late 19th century. It was among the educated, liberal middle classes that ideas of national unity following the abolition of aristocratic privileges gained popularity. So it was among the educated liberal middle classes, that ideas of national unity following the abolition of aristocratic privileges gained popularity. 2.2. What did liberal nationalism stand for? Ideas of national unity in early 19th century Europe were closely allied to the ideology of liberalism. The ideas of national unity in early 19th century Europe were closely allied to the ideology of liberalism. The term liberalism derives from the Latin root liber, meaning free. For the new middle classes, liberalism stood for freedom for the individual and equality of all before the law. Politically, it emphasized the concept of government by consent. Since the French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of aristocracy. So, since the French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of autocracy and clerical privileges, a constitution and representative government through parliament. 19th century liberals also stressed the inviolability of private property. Yet, equality before the law did not necessarily stand for universal suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. You will recall that in revolutionary France, which marked the first political experiment in liberal democracy, the right to vote and to get elected was granted exclusively to property owning men. So, as we have seen in France, that the right to vote and to get elected was granted exclusively to property owning men. Men without property and old women. So, men without property and old women were excluded from political rights. Only for a brief period under the Jacobins did all adult males enjoy suffrage. However, the Napoleonic Code went back to limited suffrage and reduced women to the status of a minor, subject to the authority of father and husbands. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, women and non-propertied men organized opposition movements demanding equal political rights. In the economic sphere, liberalism stood for the freedom of markets and the abolition of state-imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. So, in the economic sphere, liberalism stood for the freedom of markets and the abolition of state-imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. During the 19th century, this was a strong demand of the emerging middle classes. Let us take the example of the German-speaking regions in the first half of the 19th century. Napoleon's administrative measures had created out of countless small principalities a confederation of 39 states. Napoleon's administrative measures had created out of countless small principalities a federation of 39 states. Each of these possessed its own currency. So they possessed its own currency and weights and measures. A merchant traveling in 1833 from Hamburg to Nuremberg to sell his goods would have had to pass through 11 customs barriers and pay a customs duty of about 5% at each one of them. Duties were often levied according to the weight or measurement of the goods. As each region had its own system of weights and measures, this involved time-consuming calculations. The measure of cloth, for example, was the ell, which in each region stood for a different length, and ell of textile material bought in Frankfurt would get you 54.7 centimeter of cloth, in Mainz 55.1 centimeter, in Nuremberg 65.6 centimeter, in Freiburg, so in Freiburg it would be 53.5 centimeter. Here's a source, source B. Economists began to think in terms of the national economy. They talked of how the nation could develop and what economic measures could help forge this nation together. Friedrich List, professor of economics at the University of Tübingen in Germany, wrote in 1834, "The aim of the Zollverein is to bind the Germans economically into a nation." So the aim of the Zollverein is to bind the Germans economically into a nation. It will strengthen the nation materially as much by protecting its interest externally as by stimulating its internal productivity. It ought to awaken and raise national sentiment through a fusion of individual and provincial interest. The German people have realized that a free economic system is the only means to engender national feeling. So the German people have realized that a free economic system is the only means to engender national feeling. Such conditions were viewed as obstacles to economic exchange and growth by the new commercial classes, who argued for the creation of a unified economic territory, allowing the unhindered movement of goods, people, and capital. In 1834, a customs union or Zollverein. So in 1834, a customs union or Zollverein was formed at the initiative of Prussia and joined by most of the German states. The union abolished tariff barriers and reduced the number of currencies from over 30 to 2. The creation of a network of railways further stimulated mobility, harnessing economic interest to national unification. A wave of economic nationalism strengthened the wider nationalist sentiments growing at the time. So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.